November 1991. Magic Johnson announces his retirement from the LA Lakers as he reveals he has the HIV virus. The Undertaker beat Hulk Hogan to become the new World Wrestling Federation champion. And Russian President Boris Yeltsin outlaws the Communist Party. A lot of things changed in that month, and one of the biggest changes came with Thomas and Friends, as the third season was released exclusively on VHS in the UK on the 11th of November 1991, in the US on the 18th of November 1991, and finally on UK television on the 25th of February 1992. This is the story of Thomas and Friends Season 3. A lot can change in 5 years, and there is no better example in the production history of Thomas and Friends. After Season 2 had wrapped up, there was a lot of changes that began. We'll start with Britt Allcroft, as she was finding ways to make Thomas and Friends a global entity, not just exclusively to the UK. It was pitched to US audiences as part of the TV show Shining Time Station, and then presented to Japanese audiences as well. Both markets fell in love with Thomas and Friends. Ringo Starr had carried on as part of Shining Time Station in a new role of Mr. Conductor. But before the third season went into production, Starr left Thomas and Friends to pursue his music career. I have went on record saying I think this was a mistake, and I will stand by that until the end of time. But not only did Starr leave the US versions, he also left the UK version as well, meaning that both had to scramble to find a narrator and a Mr. Conductor. For the US audiences, in stepped very outspoken comedian George Carlin. This 5-time Grammy Award-winning stand-up comedian, actor, social critic, and author was known for his dark comedic humour and his satirisation of American culture. In a very rare move for this outspoken comedian, Carlin spoke very highly of his time on Thomas and Friends. He wanted audiences to see him as more than the foul-mouthed comedian that he had become known for, and this was the perfect opportunity for him. In an interview on TV Legends, which was conducted shortly before his death, Carlin stated, "The morals of these stories were never jammed down the kid's throat. They weren't blatant. They weren't in capital letters. They were gently massaged into the framework of the show." Something that I think Audrey would have been very proud of hearing, as that was his goal. He never pandered to kids and always treated them with a level of intelligence that they were due. So with a US narrator found, what about the UK? Step forward, the longest running narrator of Thomas and Friends history, Michael Angelis. Angelis has appeared in several British TV programmes before his time on Thomas and Friends. With both of these castings brought a new vibrance, energy, and charm to the show. Both of them experimenting with different types of accents, different pitch and tone, and were both more engaging to the target audience of the time. But before the production of the third series, Clearwater Features had closed down, with Thomas and Friends being repackaged under Britt Allcroft's own company, the Britt Allcroft Company. Now, why did Clearwater Features close down in the first place? Many have attributed it to David Mitton and Robert D. Cardona's side project, which they were working on at the time, TUGS, a show about anthropomorphized tugboats set in the Roaring Twenties. It lasted for 13 episodes, and there was a clear love, passion, and commitment to the show. But with that passion and commitment came a ton of money being sunk into it. Mitton and Cardona expected there to be investors. Sadly, this never materialised. Their budget was drained, a slew of unfortunate lawsuits also added to the misfortune and led to Clearwater Features being shut down. I'm not going to go too much into TUGS. It's not the one that I have the most knowledge and experience of. So I refer you to the Unlucky TUGS video about the show. It gives you more insight, knowledge, and detail into things that I never even knew about. For example, did you know Britt Allcroft tried to sue David Mitton during this time around the issue of the resin faces? The lawsuit eventually was settled, and you would think that there would be no working relationship for the two of them after this. But Mitton did return to the series and stayed there until season 7. That is something that still really befuddles me. But they had a good working relationship, there was money to be made, and that's probably what sealed the deal. But this is not to say that Mitten's time away from Thomas and Friends was in vain. As a matter of fact, it benefited the show. It was clear that Mitten and those returning had used the time wisely to up their game on the production of Thomas and Friends Season 3. But this time there was an advancement in technology, especially in the camera work department. And you can tell that from the Season 2 to Season 3 change. Everything felt like you'd hit the refresh button. Colours were more vibrant. There was a notable use of sets that required water effects, a skill that they had developed while working on TUGS. And the music itself had also benefited from this time, with Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell returning to production and creating more orchestral pieces, similar to what they had learned while working on TUGS. Gone were the more 80s style sounds, and they embraced a new orchestral 90s theme, which they would only improve upon as the seasons progressed. With the step up in quality behind the scenes, Allcroft and Mitten also thought there could be a step up in terms of storytelling, which is why a lot of stories in this season were not adapted from Audrey source material, but they were in fact their own stories, adapted from magazine stories written by future Thomas Renaissance creator Andrew Brenner. However, like with a lot of this, there is a slight caveat. Allegedly, Brenner's stories were adapted to TV without his consent. But I won't get into allegedlys because we got what we got with the stories themselves. But one person who was not satisfied with the stories was the Reverend W. Audrey himself, as he talked about in his infamous documentary, The Thomas the Tank Engine Man, with Nicholas Jones. I have also interviewed Nicholas Jones, so be sure to check out that video if you get a chance. Normally this would be the section where I would also go into the characters, but in all honesty, there wasn't that many characters to introduce us to in this season. We had Oliver, the Great Western Engine, and his brake van Toad. We had Bulgy the bus, and Mavis the diesel engine. There was a cameo from the real-life engine city of Truro, and we saw the two tenders of the Flying Scotsman. Initially, Flying Scotsman was going to be in one of the episodes, but due to budgetary constraints, sadly they weren't able to make a full Gauge 1 engine replica. But where they didn't bring in new characters, or at least not a lot of them, they spent more time working on the established characters. There was a lot more development in the Little Western gang. Our Steam Team characters were given more layers to their personality and more character growth. And in turn, they actually felt like new characters as a result. I've mentioned previously that this season felt like a bit of a refresh, and that's because it was. There were so many new things that were going on between Season 2 and Season 3's production that once again, it did feel like they were trying to take the next steps in their evolution. It's why I personally really enjoy the classic era, because it always felt like they were trying to hit that refresh button and see what they can add to it to make it different from the previous seasons. And that's probably a good segue to lead into my own thoughts on Thomas and Friends Season 3. Before I go into my thoughts, I do need to tell you a little story. And trust me, it does tie into what I'm going to say. A lot of my top 10 best and worst list episodes have only been on the channel since between 2022 and 2023. But what you don't realise is that those videos are actually older than that. I mentioned in my personal journey with Thomas and Friends that I had experimented with a couple of videos on my personal channel, my own Andrew Durning channel. I know some of you have subscribed already, but the link will be in the description if you want to do so. I didn't just experiment with a top 10 best characters and a top 10 worst characters video. I did top 10 best and worst episodes lists up until about Season 10. It gave me the time to experiment with technique in terms of sound recording, script writing, and opinion pieces, with these originally coming out in 2021, when I was still in recovery from my mental health issues. So as such, the opinions that I held then, I don't necessarily agree with now. A lot of the key points I do, because they're points that I do stand by, but with time, you grow more mature and you're more appreciative of the work that's done. There's no denying that from a visual standpoint and a technical standpoint, Season 3 really upped its game, and I've never denied that. But I do prefer the Audrey stories to most of the original stories, which you may find weird because, like most kids of the time, I was introduced to the TV show first and discovered the Railway series books as I got older. But again, I think because I discovered the books as I got older, I appreciated more of the themes and more of the real world events around them. By this point, even though they weren't pandering to kids, the show was still targeted for young children. So they were trying to not only appeal to that younger audience, but keep it engaging so the audiences who had already started to grow up with the series, like myself, would engage with it. And that can be a fine line to walk. Sometimes you do it very well, and sometimes you don't do it very well. And in the case of this season, I would say it was a bit of a mixed bag. Kind of like the release order of this season. They had a part 1, which came out first, and then a part 2, which felt somewhat detached from part 1. Season 3 is the epitome of that detachment. They were trying to do 2 different things, but they never really gel as a whole season. So I'm going to start my ranking of Thomas and Friends Season 3. Once again, these are all my own personal opinions. Your list will definitely be different from mine, as I've learned doing a little bit of research into other content creators. Let me know in the comments what you think of the video and how you would rank Season 3. But all I ask is that you be respectful, and above all, enjoy the video. Okay, let's dive in. Number 26, Thomas gets bumped. Thomas's branch line is closed due to Buckle's tracks on the line. Thomas begins to think that he's lost his passengers to Bertie, but gets surprised when repairs are completed. I am not a big fan of this story. I find it's very disjointed and it's quite hard to focus on. Initially, I had a bit of a problem with the premise of the episode because it's called Thomas Gets Bumped, yet there is no actual bump that takes place. There is an accident with the hot sun warping the railway tracks and Thomas comes off of them, but that's not a bump. A bump is an engine crashing into something, like bumping into another engine, crashing into tar wagons, to quote James from season 1. So this isn't a bump, it's an accident. But then I started thinking about it, and I think the title of the story is more a metaphor to how Thomas is feeling throughout this episode. Thomas is worried that his passengers are going to be taken away, and after he has this accident, that does happen. His passengers are given to Bertie so that he can carry on the scheduled stops and routes as normal. So Thomas feels like he has been bumped off. He's lost his passengers, they like Bertie better than him now, he is no longer useful. But the Fat Controller realises that Thomas and Bertie are very good as a unit, and rearranges the timetable so they can work together more. And this also shows the friendship of Thomas and Bertie. So while I'm not a big fan of the story, and I don't think I ever will be, I do appreciate more of the subtext around it. Number 25, Percy, James and the Fruitful Day. Percy and James both learn that brakes are not the only thing that can get jammed. I find it quite ironic because fruit is usually very colourful, vibrant and uplifting, whereas the story is very bland. George Carlin had stated that one of the things that he liked about Thomas and Friends was that the morals weren't spoon-fed to children. This episode very much contradicts that. Thomas does his mansplaining at the end, where he tells you the entire moral of the story, and the moral of the story is nothing really relevant. I mean, what honestly do we learn from the moral of this story? Things just don't work out. Not very good. And the whole, we're really useful engines after all. It feels like it's signs of a different era that is due to come. Number 24, Thomas, Percy, and the Dragon. Percy teases Thomas about being frightened all the time, but when Thomas is delivering a Chinese dragon in the night, it's Percy who becomes the frightened engine. A conclusion to Ghost Train that we didn't necessarily need, but I'm okay with having. It's a good spooky episode. It shows some of the nighttime visuals that they start to play with, but there is something that I do want to address. I mentioned in my worst episodes video that I felt that the arrival of the Chinese dragon and the music that was played around it could be seen as quite racist by today's standards. A lot of you hit back on me with that, saying that they didn't think it was racist. That's fine if you think that, you are entitled to your opinion. For me though, it did make me feel uncomfortable when I watched it. I didn't feel uncomfortable back then, as a kid, but times have moved on since then. This dropped in 1991 and 1992. A lot has changed. We are allowed to feel uncomfortable about things that we maybe thought was okay back then. It shows signs of growth and maturity. I'm not saying that anybody involved in it is racist. I'm not saying that anybody involved in Thomas and Friends had any type of ulterior motive. For me, it just felt a bit off. But the music itself is really good. The visuals are really strong. And as it being a sequel that you don't necessarily expect, I would say it's all right. Number 23, Thomas Percy and the Post Train. Percy and Thomas are often given a job delivering the post train, but after the mail boat gets delayed one evening, Harold takes over both engines' work. Now we come to talk about the nighttime visuals that I mentioned in the previous entry. I swear, they didn't intend to be back to back, it just kinda happened. Visuals, amazing. The score, fantastic. But the story, it's a letdown. There's nothing much to it, doesn't really ring true with me, and for me, like the previous entry, it starts to set up this whole Thomas and Percy are going to be best friends going forward. At this point though, they're still in the begrudging co-workers phase, with Thomas starting to warm up to Percy a bit more and confide in him. And I think that is a progressive step. It shows Thomas is maturing as a character. It shows that when it comes to something work related that there's a grievance about, that they both need to find a common solution to, that he'll trust the person that he's working with, and they will come to said solution. But the fact that it leads into them just becoming, we're best friends and we tell each other everything, that I'm not too fond of. But it does set up one thing going forward, which is quite crucial to the identity of one of the characters, Percy delivering the mail. I understand why Thomas would have been bumped from this particular job. How about that? I mentioned bumped again. Because he already has so much to do. Percy, while he has been helping with certain jobs, he doesn't really have one of his own. So the TV series essentially made one up for him. He pulls a mail train. And it also carries on this best frenemies thing with Harold, which we can then tap into in later seasons. So upon reflection, maybe the story does have a bit more going for it in terms of world building, but the actual story itself, bland and repetitive. Number 22, One Good Turn. Bill and Ben end up in an argument at the turntable, so Boko makes a plan to make the twins become friends again. What I like about this is that we have Bill, Ben, Boko, and Edward in an episode. This was established in season 2, and they've carried it into season 3. We see that they all still work together. It's their own little patch of the island, and they can have their own little adventures on it. I don't like the episode though. I describe this episode as a storm in a teacup, and it's because of the incident that is meant to cause this big fallout. It's a fuss over nothing. They wind up in each other's way because of them using the turntable. And this causes this big stramash that they fall out over when it's neither of their faults. I understand having twin boys that they'll fight over the most ridiculous of things, and you as a parent have to try and find a way to get them to fall back in. But the beauty of it is, with twins, they don't need outside interference. Eventually they start to miss each other and fall back in. Most of the time, pretty damn quickly. It was inventive, the idea that they came up with to get them to fall back into place, but just not a great episode. Sorry guys. Number 21, All at Sea. When the regatta comes, Duck wishes that he could travel the sea, but he later learns that he is happiest on the rails. Oh, I'm going to get crucified for this one. A lot of you love All at Sea, and I will admit, I have warmed up to All at Sea on future viewings. And I also like that we explore a different side of Duck's character. It's not what has happened, it's how it's happened that has kind of thrown me. With this, and another entry that I will get to, the personality shift is so out of left field and such a 180 that it threw me. I was used to seeing Duck as someone who was proud of his great Western heritage, someone who worked hard, someone who revelled in responsibility, and also had a little bit of a cheeky, prickish side to him if he was mistreated, or felt like someone needed to be put in their place. So Duck already felt quite well-rounded to me. You knew about him in a work hard capacity, you also knew about him in a play hard capacity. He wasn't afraid to make jokes or wind people up or stand up for the little guy. So this random point where he loves the sea to the point that it distracts him from every type of trait that Duck has felt a little bit disjointed. I do understand it though, because sometimes people can surprise you. The visuals are really great. The use of running water effects, which they learn from TUGS, are definitely on display here. But the story is Number 20, Edward, Trevor, and the Really Useful Party. Edward and Trevor help the vicar with his garden party to fund a seaside trip for the children. And when Bertie becomes a stick in the mud, Terence comes to his rescue. Another one that with repeat viewings, I've enjoyed a bit more. I mainly like it because we get to focus on road vehicles. Trevor, Terence, and Bertie. It's an episode that, on the whole, is devoted to them. And I like that because as the franchise progresses, that comes to a grinding halt. Terence and Trevor just seem to drop off the face of the earth, and Bertie just slowly whittles away, becoming essentially your only insight into the roads. Then eventually not at all, and they start to make a bit of a comeback. But I do think it was episodes like this that probably led to that downfall, because it is quite bland, it's a bit slow and meandering, doesn't really do anything, and they have to randomly add Edward at the start and the end of it just to keep the hook for people who are there for the talking choo-choo trains. Not the worst. It does feel a little bit disjointed. That's that. Number 19. Henry's Forest. Henry's favourite place on the island of Sodor is the forest. He is very sad where a storm damages the trees. Now this is one that I've had the most reflection on. In my worst lists video, this was the third worst episode for me. A lot of it around the whole Wilbert Audrey Rule 55 thing. And again, it does have this sudden 180 of finding out about a side to a character that we never knew existed. But there is a difference between Henry and Duck. With Duck, we find out that he likes the sea, and then it's never really brought up again. With Henry, at least, they established this gentler side to him, and that he likes the forest. And the Hit era actually expanded upon it. They gave it more screen time and more understanding. They even mention it in other parts of the classic era, because I know some of you will be like, Duck was cut out of the Hit era, that's why there's no expansion on it. But even in the rest of the classic era, they never give you any more insight as to why Duck loved the horizon and the ocean. At least, with this aspect of Henry's character, they did go into more detail with it. That being said though, guys, I still am not a big fan of it. It doesn't mean that I don't appreciate it more as I've gotten older, but for a show that really tried to be as realistic as possible, to having something like this completely shatter the realism with the Rule 55 stuff, it's why it's not as high up on the list. And a lot of people have actually said to me to put up or shut up and try and develop a story around this, to which I have. I wrote a story around Rule 55, haven't made the episode because I don't know how to work any of that online gaming software for shit, but if anyone's interested in doing it and could do it to a high standard, let me know. Number 18, no joke for James. James plays a trick on Thomas and Gordon which gets him into trouble. He soon learns that an engine does not have to pull coaches to be useful. Now this is where I feel that the flanderization parts of characters were starting to come into play. James, obsessed with his red paint, kinda starts here. Yes, he's talked about how he's a splendid red engine and ready for anything in previous seasons and the books. That's more about that he himself is a pompous ass, not that he just loves his red paint. It is quite a good James episode when you break it down, but the story itself felt rushed, especially the happy tacked on ending. I would have liked to have seen this if it was done in seasons 1 and 2 with a 2-part arc. We have the first episode, which would probably stop around the point where he gets rumbled by the Fat Controller and is sent to the sheds. And then the second part is when he gets out and starts to redeem himself, maybe leading up to seeing this Inspector and taking him to see the Fat Controller. A bit more time to flesh it out and a bit more development into the character again. As such, the way it's done, we got what we got, and it's why it takes it down for me. Number 17, Buzz Buzz. After James visits Trevor in the vicarage orchard and is told about the bees and their hives, he thinks that he can easily make them buzz off, but is proved wrong when an accident in the station sets loose an entire swarm. A lot of the Reverend W. Audrey stories that are in this season have something in common. They have an entirely different beginning than they do in the Railway series books. Reason being is that they tie into stories that are not adapted in this season, but previous seasons. This is one of them. This story comes off of Boko's introduction, which would have been the Diseasel in season 2. Now we're a season deep, they want to try and make the story stand on its own, so they have to create a different intro. And while I think this was actually a really inventive way to lead into Buzz Buzz, I'm just not a fan of the actual story itself. I do like the sequence of how James tries to get the bees off his boiler. I think that was quite inventive. but I'm not a fan of the cartoon B, even though I know that at the time it was made, it was probably the only realistic way they could do it. This is something that maybe could have been lended to if it was adapted in the Brenner era for CGI. But it's not to say the cartoon B does not have its charm, because a lot of you like it. But once again, the very happy moral of the story ending didn't sit well with me, especially when you read the story in the book. Number 16, Time for Trouble. Gordon has been working hard too often and is sent for a rest, so James pulls the express for him. However, his journey gets difficult when Toby runs out of water on the main line. Another episode that the story has a different start. I mentioned in my Season 2 ranking video, Gordon Goes Foreign was originally intended to be adapted for Season 2. However, budgetary constraints stopped it. This story picks up where Gordon Goes Foreign leaves off, because after Gordon does this trip to London and back, that's what makes him too tired and James has to take over. So they find a reach around again and just say that Gordon has been working too hard for too long while it's been busy on the island, and that's why James has to take over. It's an instance where the actual change at the start is what I enjoyed over the episode itself. I am not a fan of the episode. The thing that I really liked about it most was the dynamic of James and Toby, because they still have that butting heads rivalry from Season 1, but overall, very meh. Number 15, The Trouble with Mud. Gordon refuses to get a wash down and gets stuck with goods work for the rest of the day. But after helping James up his hill, Gordon learns that his favourite job is easier when he is clean and in order. The start is different, the end is different, the middle is Railway series, because it's taken from the story Leaves from Gordon's standalone book. But they've had to change the beginning and the end because that actually ties into when Gordon is in his disgraced period after Off the Rails. So they've created this whole thing about Gordon not wanting to be cleaned because the only thing he cares about is being important. The whole identity of his character about being important is that everything is image. Him pulling the express is about image. So him having to look good pulling the express so people will want to go on the express would also be about image. So why would he all of a sudden not care that he looks manky as anything? He would want to be washed down, polished, and look his best because pulling the express is such a public image. It would be part of his persona. And I know that it seems like I'm constantly bashing this season. I do like it, but I have to point out the flaws when they're there. Number 14, Diesel does it again. Percy and Duck are piled up with goods work at the harbour, so Diesel is brought back to help out. But his misbehaving is even worse than last time, and it causes confusion and delay. I was glad to see Diesel back. I'm not gonna lie, it felt very out of place, considering how I see Diesel from Season 2 to who he became in Season 3. Diesel in Season 2 is the embodiment of evil. Manipulative, scheming, lying, does whatever he needs to get ahead. That is Diesel. This is where we see him starting to turn into something else, more akin to a school bully. And we also see that Duck sort of loses that backbone that he had. Maybe it was because of the incident in Season 2 that just made him more wary of being around Diesel, because he knows what he's capable of. But I did like Percy in this. He had Duck's back the entire way, no matter what decisions he made. If Duck wanted to go on strike, Percy went on strike with him. When Diesel starts being bad and Duck says, no, the Fat Controller won't like this, and Diesel says, oh, who's going to tell him? Two goody telltale engines like you? They decide that they're not going to tell because they don't want to be telltales. Again, a very childish model. But the point was, if Duck wasn't going to go to bat, Percy stood by his decision. He didn't go behind his back. And I think it was more a case of that, yeah, they didn't want to be telltales, but they knew eventually that his bad behaviour would catch him out in the end. And that was exactly what happened. That's the part of Diesel that I liked about this. Instead of it being like in a close shave where the Fat Controller said, I never believed Diesel, I sent him packing, and we didn't find out what rumbled him. In this case, we did. We saw that he thought he could get away with his bad behaviour, and he eventually did something so stupid that the Fat Controller went, I'm not having you back again, even though he turns up in tender engines. But I won't lie, when I watched it when I was a kid, I did enjoy this episode, and I much prefer Michelangelo's grill for Diesel than I did Ringo Starr's because it didn't give me nightmares. Number 13, A Scarf for Percy. Percy wishes he could wear a scarf, but he learns to be careful what he wishes for when he runs into the Fat Controller's luggage and almost ruins Henry's special job. You've heard me talk a lot about stories that have an Audrey premise and then other writing around it, and it drags the episode down. This is not one of those episodes. I think the stuff around it actually brings the episode up. When you read this story in the Henry the Green Engine book, it feels so out of place. Like there's no reason for it to be there aside from to highlight the fact that Percy is still around. It doesn't make sense. The way that they write the story around this, it makes sense. Percy is sick and tired of the cold. He wants to find other ways to keep him warm, one of which is a scarf to keep his funnel warm. And I think that's actually pretty solid. I love Henry and Percy's little exchange between them. The whole engines with proper funnels do, you've only got a small one. When you get older and your mind is as warped as mine, you laugh your ass off at that. I also love the winter visuals. The shot of Percy when he's going past the canal, and you see that little canal boat at the side, that entire sequence, beautiful. And I thought the ending wasn't too bad either. Number 12, Heroes. Bill and Ben cause a big muddle in the yard, but all is forgiven when they behave bravely when rescuing a bunch of workmen from a rock slide at the clay pits. An episode that I didn't expect to like as much as I did, but I do. And I think it is the whole rock slide sequence that really elevates it for me. It does feel like it's two separate stories merged into one episode, so it can feel a little disjointed, but you have the setup where they're thinking nothing really exciting happens, so they get to go and do their little turn at the yard, and the trucks are able to manipulate them. I don't get why Bill and Ben would be so easily fooled by it because they're used to trucks, but at the same time, they're trucks that they're not used to, and maybe nerves just get the better of them, and that's how they wound up making that massive mess. But the rock slide sequence, the fear of possibly leaving someone behind to get crushed by the rock slide, and when it all just falls apart after they've got away, very well done, brilliantly directed. The score was really strong, just a good episode. Number 11, Thomas and Percy's Christmas Adventure. Thomas, Percy, Harold and Terence help some villagers after a severe snowstorm, and the engines get a special Christmas surprise. This episode makes me really glad that I am based in the UK. For the normies watching this is why. This episode has two different versions in the US. The Christmas Adventure and a Thanksgiving Adventure, where instead of it being Christmas time in the island of Sodor, it's coming up on Thanksgiving. A lot of people believe that it was done to appeal to an American market. Over in Scotland and over in the UK, we don't have Thanksgiving. It's not a thing for us. So we only got the original Christmas Adventure as it was originally intended. I have watched both, and I think the original is better, because the Thanksgiving one does feel like it was just pandering to the Americans. I have nothing against American audiences. I know you watch my channel. I am so damn grateful to you. So I understand why they would want to appeal to your market. But I just love this episode and its original guys. The score is fantastic. Some of the shots that are used in the winter effects are amazing. I think this was where they peaked in terms of the Christmas style and winter settings. They have great ones going forward, and they had great previously, but it felt like this was where they found their footing. This was the level that they wanted to always try and hit. And the story itself isn't bad. I have the book version of this, and I used to read it to my kids at bedtime. It gave us that Christmassy feel. Number 10, Trust Thomas. Bertie learns that he can trust engines when Thomas remembers a missing tar tanker after having an accident with some trucks. This episode is Thomas-centric, but we all know by now that it needs to be Thomas-centric because they need Thomas in almost everything that they do. But the story itself is pretty coherent, and it shows a new, more mature side of Thomas, a more caring, more helpful side. A lot of people think that that was just pandering to the younger audience. I don't think so. I think this was starting to show the growth that we were wanting to see from Thomas. Again, it does feel a little bit out of left field, but if we keep with real time, a lot has changed in 5 years. You changed in 5 years. What's not to say that Thomas hasn't as well? I really like the crash, but I wasn't as big a fan of the music for the crash. It did make it feel a little silly. Now, I love Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell. I have spoke to Mr. O'Donnell, as you know. The music that they work on is great, and the music itself is really good. I just think it was the wrong choice of music for this crash. I think this crash was actually quite serious and quite severe, especially the end where he just seems to be sinking into the water. All I was thinking before the next scene was, someone get him out of that bloody water before he drowns. I would have loved to have heard a different musical accompaniment behind it, like the Runaway theme, for example. They've been able to shorten that for ones like Dirty Objects, so that's where I think it could have been used. Aside from that, I really enjoyed this episode. A lot more than I was expecting to. Number 9, Percy's promise. Percy promises that he will take the Vicar's Sunday School children home. In spite of heavy rain and a flooded track, he keeps his promise thanks to some help from Harold. This is an episode where I actually think it being cut from season 2 benefited it. Now, in the course of those 5 years, David Mitton has worked on TUGS. He has become very familiar with water effects. He's become very familiar with rain and wind and all these different techniques that he has been able to use. I think if he had tried this in season 2, it wouldn't have been as visually appealing. Who knows what could have happened to the model of Percy if they hadn't figured out all the stuff that he needed to do. Could have electrocuted the poor bugger. I love the storm theme. I love the story. I love the next part of Percy and Harold's frenemy dynamic, where you actually see that Harold isn't a total prick. He comes to help rather than laugh at Percy for his predicament. People have wondered why Edward was in it, because they feel like he was shoehorned in for no reason. And I do kind of get that, but I'm still glad to see Edward. I know it's basically he's just there to say, be careful Percy, there's a storm coming, and Percy's just like, I'll be fine. But it worked. Number 8, Bulgy. A double-decker bus named Bulgy claims that railways should be closed, but after he steals Duck and Oliver's passengers, an accident puts an end to his lies. I think Bulgy of season 3 is Devious Diesel of season 2 in road form. He's evil, he's manipulative, he is scheming, and just a downright nasty bus. But I love him for it. And again, where his improvement over Diesel is, you see the consequences of his actions in it. He's anarchistic, he's a road rebel, he's just great. And his punishment at the end, where he just winds up getting turned into a hen house, I thought was rather funny. And I know that they mentioned Bulgy's friend in this, saying that he's there, he's rude, and he's taking their passengers too. But we never see him. I don't think we saw him in the Railway series book either. I don't get why you would reference this bus if you're not going to do anything with the bus. Because all of the plan seems to revolve around Bulgy. You don't see his accomplice. Maybe that's something for fan fiction. Who knows? But one thing that always really confused me, you know that set that they had where there was like the 3 layers? Most of the time it was engine in the top one, engine running through the middle, engine at the bottom going under that bridge. In this episode, Bulgy is at the top and Duck is going through the middle. When did they change that layout? Number 7, Donald's Duck. Duck is given his own branch line for his hard work and becomes conceited, which makes Donald tease him until Duck and his crew play a joke on him. This was what I really liked about Donald and Douglas in this season, and also in the Railway series. The twins weren't always joined at the tender. They had their own adventures, they had their own lives, and they had their own friendships separate from each other. And Donald had Duck. It shows that there is a dynamic between Duck and Donald. They have that best friends camaraderie that not necessarily Duck and Douglas have, which is also shown in a couple more episodes in this season. It's never Duck and Douglas that are together, it's Duck and Donald. They seem to gravitate to each other and have that mutual respect. And it does show a little bit of a softer side to Donald because he keeps this little duck and looks after it. Number 6, Tender Engines. When a visitor comes to Sodor, Henry becomes jealous of his 2 tenders and wants another tender for himself. He gets his wish, but not in the way he wanted. This is an episode that once again was changed to appeal to a younger demographic and not deal with a serious issue, which ironically they deal with in another entry. The start of this episode deals with the fact that Gordon is upset because Devious Diesel tells him that Diesels are taking over and it's not going to save him from inevitably getting the Cutter's torch. All down to the fact that we see the 2 tenders of the Flying Scotsman. Now Gordon is upset by this and asks the Fat Controller if it's true that Diesels are taking over, and the Fat Controller tells him not to worry because it'll never happen on his railway. Now, this is very, very loosely based on a Railway series story, where Gordon does find out that all of his Doncaster brothers are dead. They've all been scrapped on the other railway. And the Fat Controller doesn't sugarcoat the fact. He tells them that's what's going on, but it won't happen on his railway. So we kind of missed the mark of the most crucial thing that they eventually do touch on in another episode. Scrapping is real, and it is coming. They hint at it in season 2, and they could have doubled down on it in season 3, but not to the extent that I think they should have done. They kind of chickened out with this one. But this does tie into a point I just mentioned about the last episode. We again see a Duck and Donald dynamic because they in turn decide to play a trick on Henry. Henry is very jealous about the Flying Scotsman's 2 tenders and thinks that he deserves them. Duck gives that sly little look to Donald and goes, "Want to mess with him? Aye, let's mess with him." Offering him 6 tenders. And you see the cheeky nature of Duck. This is the side of him that I like, and it's already been established in previous episodes. If an engine's getting too big for his boiler, he's not afraid to take them down a peg. And he does by offering him 6 tenders filled with boiler sludge. And the whole thing of have a good washout, you'll feel a different engine. It's a very adult joke for a kids show. It's essentially implying that he's constipated and needs to get everything out of his system. So it is very accurate when it's brought up earlier in the episode about Gordon and he says, "Don't be vulgar." It really was vulgar. That being said, I did like the adaptation, even though there was flaws. Number 5, Mavis. A new diesel engine named Mavis reorganises things at the quarry, but when she goes down the farm lane, Toby gets the last laugh. And oh boy, have I had the last laugh with this one, guys. Remember I said in season 2 that there was backlash around the look of Daisy, with some people thinking that it was sexist. A lot of people, as they tend to do, trolled me on that remark. It's fair play. I do this type of content. I do expect the trolling. But this is where I get the last laugh on you. Rick Sigelko, an American producer, director and writer who was the co-creator of Shining Time Station along with Britt Allcroft, mentioned how he disapproved of Daisy's design. Sigelko had mentioned that her design was rather sexist, and it was why they not only did not show Daisy's episodes in Shining Time Station, but why she was also cut from the 3rd season of Thomas and Friends. Because in the story Mavis, Daisy was the person that Mavis confided in. I thought that that was the wrong move at the time. With it being Diesel instead, it felt more like a we Diesels have to stick together rather than us girls should stick together. But the reason she was replaced with Diesel was because of her look and the fact that it was considered extremely sexist by US audiences. So I'm sorry guys, I am entering smug mode with this one. I don't mind when you challenge me, but when I know I'm right and I have the evidence to back it up, I gladly revel in it. And it was also why Mavis's design was altered. In the Railway series books, she does have makeup. She has lipstick. She has a little bit of eyeshadow. But in the TV series, she wasn't given that. It was more neutral tones. And I think it worked well because Mavis became a long-standing character of the franchise and Daisy did not. It's probably also why her resin face design and the makeup on it was dulled down when the switch was made to CGI. So it wasn't just me that found it sexist, guys. There was a basis on it, and there was a backlash around it. Now with that out of the way, I really, really enjoyed this episode because I really enjoy the stories that it's based on and how true to the stories the episodes were. I love that Mavis is headstrong. I love that she's stubborn. She's full of her own ideas. She's young and inexperienced, and having Toby paired against her is the perfect foil for that. It's a very good kind of father-daughter dynamic. Toby knows that he knows better. She's telling him to wrap it, and when it comes back to bite her, Toby is very like, nah, just let her rot. Until he finds out that it's actually him that's going to get in trouble for it. The way it's filmed was fantastic, but I am a little bit sad because the ending theme tune, you know, the little one that kind of leads into the credits that was used in season 1 and season 2, it's the last time they used it in this episode. I loved that little theme. Number 4, Oliver owns up. Oliver becomes conceited and thinks that he can manage trucks, but is soon proven wrong. This episode really shows that pride does come before a fall. Now, Oliver has done something absolutely amazing in the episode previous to this that no engine has been able to do. On their own steam, be saved from scrap. Aside from Douglas helping out, but we'll get to that point. He has made it onto Sodor, getting safe passage along with Toad the brake van. And of course, because his story is pretty inspirational, the other engines do find him an inspiration, where we infamously hear the word sagacity off of Gordon the Big Engine. Now you can search this word online and you can very, very rarely find the definition of it. It's a word that has sadly been lost to time. It is about being clever, about being wise, but that's why I do believe that media should not be altered. If you take the word sagacity out of there, no one will have a clue what it is. So let's keep sagacity going. Now, of course, Oliver hears all these compliments and thinks that he is the ticket until he comes up against the trucks. And once again, the Donald and Duck dynamic is very well played here. It shows that Duck is going to try and actually help Oliver, but Donald is just like, nah, it's a pity, but he's got to learn on his own. A true Scottish way to look at things. And the sequence where he finally gets his comeuppance off of the trucks, you actually don't know who to root for, because Oliver's been being a prick this whole time, but the trucks are the biggest pricks in the whole of Sodor. So you don't want them to get a win either. But by the end, you do feel sorry for him. I love that nighttime shot of him just hanging from the crane. And the ending shot as well, where it seems to wrap everything up, is very nice. But I'm so glad that we do get the conclusion to this in the following season. Number 3, Gordon and the Famous Visitor. Gordon is jealous when a famous engine named City of Truro comes to visit Sodor, who happens to have no dome. So he tries to go faster than him to prove to Duck that domeless engines aren't respectable. The first time that a real-life engine comes to visit Sodor. This is accurate to the books, but the story around it, not as much. When City of Truro arrives in the books, he speaks to Duck because he's a fellow Great Westerner. Duck gets an inflated ego, and it in turn leads to all the shenanigans that happen in his Duck and Diesel book. Obviously, that story arc is past because it was in season 2, so they had to tweak it a little bit. Truro's come because he's this grand engine. The other engines think that Truro's going to be too conceited to talk to lower engines like him. Turns out he's not, and chats away to them all night. And this makes Gordon very jealous because someone else is getting the adulation that he thinks that he deserves, which in turn leads to the domeless engine story that is based on the Railway series book. I love the score. I love the directing. I just think this is a really good, really strong Gordon episode, and it just shows how proud that he is to be the express engine that can supposedly do all of these things and then gets knocked down to earth when it turns out he can't. Number 2, Toby's tightrope. Mavis makes a plan to go down the quarry line, but she ends up putting Toby in danger. This is a fantastic episode. I love everything about it. I love how faithful it is to the original story, with shots basically matching up from the illustrations in the book. I love how well it was filmed. I love the score. I love the Mavis and Toby dynamic. I love the whole scene where Toby is basically dangling over that bridge. It's so suspenseful. The story itself is fantastic. It was why I always felt that Ghost Train and Woolly Bear were the letdown stories of the 26th book of the Railway series. You could tell that these were the ones that if Audrey had to write 2 more stories, he had them in his back locker and they were fantastic. And the other 2 felt like throw them in because publishers want them. Still enjoy them, but these are of superior quality. And you can tell that because of the care and the dedication that was taken when it was transferred to screen. And the number 1 episode of Thomas and Friends, season 3, to absolutely no fan's surprise, is Escape. Douglas travels to a station where only the diesels work. He meets a Great Western engine named Oliver and a brake van named Toad, escaping from a fate that all engines fear. Now, once again, this story has a little something that is different from the books. I mentioned in my season 2 video, and also in my missing coach video, that the one thing you never found out in season 2 was that Douglas was actually the stowaway. It's why it made sense in the books that it was Douglas that rescued Oliver, because Douglas knew that he wouldn't have been able to stow away without Donald. He didn't have the strength to do it without his brother. But when he's at this place where only the diesels work and finds Oliver and Toad and sees that they are trying to do this on their own but don't have the resources to carry on doing it, of course Douglas is going to step up and help. Now, with what we know now about all the stuff around the missing coach Hello Twins episodes that were scrapped and how it was going to plan out, it could have easily been done in Railway series style. But we didn't have that at the time. So what they gave us to make this make sense was actually really well done. You see Edward and Trevor talking, Douglas goes past and is a bit pissed off about it because he's overworked. So later on, Edward
gives him what for. Tells him that Trevor and he are old friends, and that actually Trevor and Douglas have a lot in common because they were both on the chopping block to get scrapped in the previous season. And it also establishes that the Fat Controller does need another engine on the railway because the workload is getting too much for them. So when Donald goes and does that late night run, sees Oliver, hears that he's escaping from scrap, all the pieces come together. The stuff that we know as the audience, because he knows about what happened with Trevor and how Edward and the Vicar saved him, but also the stuff that your general audience doesn't know because Douglas was the stowaway that could have suffered the same fate. This episode is a cinematic masterpiece. Everything from when Douglas starts working that night until the end is just beautiful. Great camera work, great visuals, great lighting, great set design, great use of sound, great music, great cinematography, great voice acting from Angelus. It's all amazing. All the fans know this because this episode is either their favourite episode of all time or in their top 5, and rightly so. It showed exactly what this series was about, and it's why so many people use this episode as an example as to why this show was not a kids' show. It's all wrapped up in this episode. Between Escape and Edward's exploit, they are the ones that constantly chop and change between my number 2 and number 1 ranking. Some days Escape is at number 1, some days Edward's exploit is at number 1, but they're both up there for a reason. These 2 episodes would be the ones that I would put on for the normies and say, this is why I still love Thomas the Tank Engine at the age that I am at now. And that is my ranking list from Thomas and Friends Season 3. I am not going to lie, this one has been quite tough to do. There was a lot I wanted to say. I just don't feel like I have the intellectual capacity to sum it up in the way that I feel it should be summed up. Because there are great points to it, but there are also some bad ones. Season 3 is perfectly flawed. It is not a home run by any stretch of the imagination. The bits it gets right, it more than excels at. And the bits that it gets wrong, it really just collapses on itself. But let me know in the comments what you think. How would you rank Season 3? I don't often have to repeat myself on this point, but recently I feel like I have to. Please keep the comments respectful, or they will be deleted. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep on chugging.